Nazanin, thank you very much for being here in the studio of VOA Qatar Service.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a question about the condition of the Iranian people, especially after more than 6 months of implementation of the accord, the nuclear agreement, I mean. How the people looks like now?
People were very excited when it came to the nuclear agreement. We saw celebrations when the nuclear agreement was signed last July 2015. But that excitement wasn't necessarily there. You didn't see people coming to the streets and celebrating when the implementation phase took place in January 2016. And part of that is that the Rouhani administration has promised a lot. He's had to toe this line. He's had to balance two things. On the one hand, not promising too much and tempering those expectations, because Iran has a lot that it needs to do before it can recover the economy and for that to trickle down to the people. And that will take time, that will take years. But the other hand, he's had to promise that there will be economic relief, that the sanctions relief will bring Iran some positive, will have a positive impact on the Iranian economy in order to win the acquiescence of the opponents of the nuclear agreement in Iran. And that's a very delicate balance, trying to temper expectations but giving them enough so that they want the nuclear agreement and comply with it. Now, following implementation, there's been this, the people's reaction has been mixed. On the one hand, they know that there needs to be some patience. They realize that sanctions relief doesn't mean that all the money that Iran has abroad or all the trade or all the investment will flow in immediately. But they also expect some. They want to see that their day-to-day purchasing power improves. And that is something that they haven't seen yet, particularly given the hesitation by international banks to resume relations with Iran for various issues that we can discuss. But Iran hasn't seen, for the most part, the kind of economic relief and improvement that it perceived that it would following the implementation of the nuclear deal.
In the far future, do you believe that this agreement will make some kind of a positive change in the rate of the poverty in Iran?
A lot of that depends with what happens with the money. Iranian economy is very much centralized. The Iranian economy, you have the government sector, which means that so much of the investment that goes in will be distributed among the elite. That this elite has been in place since the revolution. And the people who will benefit that are the constituencies that benefit from them. So like martyr families, they benefit, they are part of the constituency that the regime will try to look after. Then you have the gray sector, or the sort of non-formal but also not the private sector, where you have the connections, the political connections. You have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And this particular sector, including also the bunyads, they will also most likely benefit from the nuclear agreement, or else they wouldn't have acquiesced to the nuclear agreement. Now, the population that forms and benefits from these different economic actors will benefit from the nuclear agreement. But speaking of a broad sort of improvement to everyday Iranians' standard of living, that's something that will take some time. That will require the Iranian economy to actually provide a fair competition standards for the people to actually compete in the private sector, for them to be able to compete against those who have political connections. And that is that would require deep reforms, and you don't see the political will for that at the moment. And it would be a very hard battle, even for individuals like Rafsanjani or Rouhani, who would want some more competition in the private sector. But we haven't seen indications that they are able to tackle that issue. What we're seeing is probably more modest reforms.
Is it because of the conservatives in Iran, or there's another reason?
Partly because the Iranian economy is set up and has been isolated for so long from the international system that even if there was a political will within Iran to open up, it will still take some time. It would take a lot of work on the part of Iran to make the regulatory environment less burdensome, to protect foreign investment, to actually welcome foreign investment and allow people to, to be in par with international standards. But that's if there's a political will for it. The more important and the harder question when it comes to Iran is that the political elite, regardless of where their stance is, their their political views, from the moderates to the hardline conservatives, they have a vested interest in being at the center of where the money goes. And that means that they will be at the center of it, and that doesn't necessarily guarantee distribution to people. The other element of all this is empowering people economically means that they will probably rise and they will demand more political rights, and that's not something the political elite are very willing or to accommodate.
One of the important things for relieving the economy in Iran or everywhere is a matter of foreign investment in Iran. Foreign investment right now, they are doubting that the big companies is going to Iran and invest there because of a very simple reason, which it is Iran still considered as a country that sponsored terrorism. Do you agree?
That is one of the reasons why foreign investment is likely to be gradual. Iranian sponsorship of terrorism is one of the reasons why the banking sector, even if they were to be reassured by the U.S. that their engagement with Iran does not violate the residual U.S. sanctions that prohibit Iranian access to the U.S. financial system, which is a major issue on its own. But even if that were not to be the case, you have a complicated banking sector that is not compliant, is not up to date with money laundering standards, with terrorism standards, anti-terrorism measures. And for that reason, a lot of foreign companies, particularly those with exposure to U.S. jurisdiction, are afraid to go back to Iran, because that means that they will run a high risk of violating these residual sanctions. The other element of all this is not even that Iran is a state sponsor of terror, but you also have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has an extensive influence in the economy, both directly but also more opaquely through front companies, through extensions through their families. And even if we were to say that sort of secondary or tertiary connections to the IRGC is not necessarily falling under the U.S. Secondary sanctions, it still carries a reputational risk. And foreign companies, appetite for risk varies, but those are elements that will be taken into account. And foreign investment is likely to be gradual.
Do you believe there's a chance that Iran is going to withdraw from this agreement in case, for example, some change happen in the next election in Iran and the conservatives will be the main power?
When it comes to the nuclear agreement, essentially every single power center within Iran acquiesced to it or agreed it or endorsed it. One way or another, they signed up. And I think that this was part of Khamenei's very designing. He showed that he would be either supportive or not, depending on what the parliament would say, depending on what the Supreme National Security Council would say. And if you have the parliament, then you also needed the Guardian Council. And these different bodies embody the different political factions within Iran. And even though the hardline conservatives were they were begrudgingly accepting this nuclear deal because it was essentially Khamenei telling them that they had to. That opposition means that they signed up to it, and unless Iran does not receive the sufficient economic gains that it thought it would, then that's when the risk to violations to the nuclear agreement rises. At the moment, the risk is Iran is unlikely to violate the nuclear agreement in the 1 year outlook, because they realize, despite the political rhetoric that goes against criticizing the agreement, they realize that the costs of sanctions were increasingly intolerable, and they needed to do something about it, and so they signed up.
Do you think Iran regained its credibility in the international community?
The Rouhani administration came to power, and you have to see this in the eyes of Khamenei. If Khamenei did not want Rouhani in power, he would not have come to power. We've seen again and again that the regime is willing to overtly go against the will of the people. But the Rouhani administration came to power because that will was there, and because Iran wanted to put forward an image of a professional, peaceful negotiating team, and that was very much done by the Zarif team. And Iran, given the fact that they negotiated this complicated nuclear agreement, and they have complied with it, and Zarif and Secretary Kerry have kept up their communication, Iran has put an image that seems, that reverses the image that Ahmadinejad put forward to the international community. So in that sense, yes, Iran has sought to and arguably changed its image in the international scene.
But still concerns from the region, like Gulf countries, for example, Israel too, which they say they don't see any differences between Iran of Ahmadinejad and Iran of Hassan Rouhani.
I think when it comes to the Gulf states, Iran, the deep state is still there. You have Rouhani that changed the perception that the presidency had abroad, but the IRGC remains a formidable actor in Iranian politics. Ignoring that they have influence, ignoring that they have interests, ignoring that that the regional agenda was tied to the nuclear agreement would be a mistake, in my opinion. Iran wanted to separate the nuclear agreement from everything else, and the compliance that we've seen and the change that we saw from the Rouhani administration came primarily with regards to this one portfolio, and it was a nuclear agreement.
But what's the assurance for Israel, for example?
In what terms?
In the term that Ahmadinejad was saying he wants to sweep Israel from the map. What's the assurance? Why Israel should be quite sure about nothing like that going to happen in the future?
Iranian opposition to Israel hasn't gone away. The rhetoric has softened. You don't have, Rouhani goes and congratulates Jews, for example. Iranian political establishment is still anti-American, and it is still anti-Israeli, and that's part of the core ideology of Islamic Republic. For Iranian policy toward Israel to change dramatically, it's not the tone, but the policy itself. That means that the Islamic Republic has to shift, and that's not something that we're witnessing here. When it comes to Israeli perception of the nuclear agreement, it's important to remember that the IDF removed Iranian nuclear threat as one of its main threats last year in its strategy, the 5-year strategy that they published, indicating that they do see the nuclear agreement as, at least temporarily, reducing the risk of Iran developing a nuclear weapon that would threaten the state of Israel.
Many say that the nuclear agreement empowered Iran or gave a lot of power to Iran in the region, Syria, for example.
The Iranian nuclear agreement, a lot of what happened, if you want to look at the regional policy of Iran before and after the nuclear agreement, part of it has to do, you have to take into account the sort of internal rivalries that are happening in Iran, and sort of the separations of spheres of influence. Part of the reason why the IRGC likely acquiesced to the nuclear agreement was probably that they lobbied that in return for their acquiescence, recall that IRGC was the body most invested in the nuclear program. for them to agree to the restrictions on the nuclear program, they probably gained Khamenei's approval to have a freer hand when it comes to their policies abroad in the region, and that they would benefit from the nuclear agreement in order to pursue those objectives in the region. Yeah.
Iran is facing a lot of challenges inside the country. Can Iran overcome these challenges while it's facing several more challenges on the international base?
Do you have any specific challenges you mean from within?
Like economic challenges, political challenges inside, the conflict, as they label it, between reformists and conservatives.
I think when it comes to political stability and the regime stability, the most critical conflict and challenge that Iran is facing is a polarization between the moderate conservatives, and I call them conservatives because they still belong to this conservative establishment. They're in no way wanting deep political reforms. Moderate conservatives such as Rafsanjani, and even President Rouhani himself falls into the moderate conservative centrist camp. Between them and the hardline conservatives who hold Guardian Council, you have figures like Jannati, and also the IRGC. Now, there's polarization because Iran is at an intersection. Iran needs to decide which direction it wants to take. You have a nuclear agreement that runs to the core. It's an ideological challenge to the regime, because at the end of the day, Iran signed an agreement with the Great Satan for practical reasons, because they needed sanctions relief. And at the same time, you have an Iran that has hegemonic ambitions. They want to have more influence in the region. They don't want to be isolated anymore. They want their proxies and allies to be the governments of these countries. And that conflict is at its height. And it's not very clear who will win, because neither of these groups are too weak to be completely undermined, but they're also not powerful enough to consolidate. And that's the biggest challenge when it comes to the Islamic Republic going forward.
Is there any difference between the conservatives and reformists regarding the minority in Iran, for example, Kurds?
The minority issue in the political establishment doesn't get as much attention. However, I will caveat that. The reformists tend to be far more inclusive. Their narrative does not necessarily fully take into account that, it depends on what you're talking about when it comes to minorities. Is it the fact that they should be included, that their areas should be developed, that they should have political voice? Yes. But if you're talking about separatism, not so much, because that's not part of the narrative that the reformists are putting forward. The conservatives, particularly the IRGC, they have made their career off of this, these sort of the insurgencies in these areas, particularly with the Kurds. A lot of IRGC leadership, they've sort of tested themselves. They've proven their loyalty to the regime by their activities in the Kurdish region of Iran, and for them, this is not an area that you can go for. But when it comes to more inclusive rhetoric, yes, the reformists are far more inclusive. Rouhani himself has a far softer language when it comes to minorities. He is a very inclusive rhetoric. Whether or not that translates into policy is an issue that we're seeing with Iran. Partly because maybe the political will isn't there, but partly because they need to, at least there are just way too many people that they need to take care of, and they just don't have the capability to go forward with it.
What do you think the Kurdish political groups should do?
To accomplish what?
To accomplish their goals in the Iranian Kurdistan.
I don't comment on what political groups should do, but I'm sorry. Yeah, we don't comment on that. I'm sorry.
Do you believe there is a political will within the Iranian institution, the state of Iran, for solving the problem of the minorities, including the Kurds too?
Political war within Iranian institutions to resolve
The Kurdish
issue.
question, for example, in Iran.
Iran, there might be in behind the scenes. Iranians talk about a lot of things behind the scenes. That's why you have consensus when it comes to to these questions that Iran faces. However, there isn't a public debate on what these political groupings need to be doing. The one thing that you hear them speak about is a more inclusive approach. Rouhani very much exemplified this. He promised that the Kurdish language would be taught in schools. He went to Kurdistan province as his first provincial trip. He promised development money going into these regions. But that's where the debate has stopped. We haven't, there isn't a larger, broader conversation about this topic in Iran, in the political establishment.
Many international organizations that they are defending the human rights, mentioning that Iran is one on the top of the lists of violation human rights, number of executions, and other human rights abuses. Can Iran continue?
Can Iran continue? Sure. Iran, but it pays a price for it. It has paid a price for it for a long time. They've pursued these policies, and here's where I think the international community sometimes misunderstands. For example, they say that during Rouhani's administration, execution numbers have gone up. The problem is a lot of these. Unfortunately, a lot of these areas for human rights violations, they aren't done by the administration. It's the deep state. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's the judiciary that is a stronghold of the hardline conservatives. And in Iran, there's always a lot of back and forth. If there are gains for the more moderate voices in the elected offices, such as for the reformists in parliament, or for a moderate conservative or a centrist for the presidency, then the other sides of the political establishments strike back. And I think that this has been part of, if not fully, but at least partially intended to embarrass Rouhani to the international community. Rouhani is the guy who's speaking about Iran being a modern state. He speaks about the democratic values of the Islamic Republic. And you see the human rights violation record being worse during his reign, not necessarily of his doing, but of the other people in Iran who have the power to do so and probably embarrass him.
Who's paying the real price? Is it the Iranian regime or the Iranian people?
The real price for
these abuses and for these kind of policies?
Listen, well, the Iranian public is divided. Obviously, it's not a homogenous state. It's not a homogenous political establishment. If you're speaking in terms of political rights, political voice, having their voices heard, well, obviously the people are paying the price. They're not. They go to the polls, they vote, and the elected representatives, which are already narrowed because of Guardian Council vetting, they still do not necessarily, even if they wanted to, do not necessarily have the power to push forward the things that people might be asking for. Classic example in Iran, and it touches every Iranian's life, is the question of hijab. If it were up to people to decide whether they were going to wear it or not, and whether they could vote for people who would bring that change, then we might have a different outcome than obligatory hijab being imposed on people. So in those terms, of course, and in economic terms, Iranian youths, they have one of the highest graduation rates, literacy rates in the region. A lot of women graduate from higher education. And Iran has a scarily high brain drain rate, because a lot of these individuals do not have the opportunities at home, and so they seek employment abroad. And that actually is a problem that Rouhani has acknowledged. It actually is to the detriment of the country in the future. if they can't retain talent. But these are the things, the indicators that we can look at to see who's paying the price for the policies pursued by the state.
But what does it mean, acknowledgement, while there is no acts?
I'm sorry?
What does it mean, acknowledgement, for these kind of situations in Iran, while there is no any act to solve the internal cases inside the country?
It tempers, it tapers a little bit of the grievances. For example, and I say this because I've heard from people, when you have a person like Rouhani stand up to the Guardian Council, even if it's just words, it means something to the people, because nobody has come out and said something, oh, Guardian Council, who are you? Like Rafsanjani said this, who are you to make decisions about who gets elected or not? And that means something. It doesn't necessarily change the dynamics too much. It didn't change the outcome, the number of people who got vetted or not. But it meant something, at least symbolically, because at least there is somebody who, within the establishment, part of the revolution, who's recognizing that there is a problem, and that means something to the people. However, public grievances don't just go away when you have symbolic gains, and that's something that Iran has to, the government has to deal with. You know, they have the capability to contain and put down any sort of, you know, unrest that might stem from these grievances at the moment. But Iran is facing a generational challenge. You have a large population of youth who feel disenfranchised, and the Islamic Republic is getting old. The core group is getting old, and the transfer from the revolutionary generation to the next generation is a challenge that they're facing, and I don't think they've figured out how they're gonna manage that yet.
And what do you mean by the Islamic regime is getting old?
The people who were part of the revolution, the engine behind the revolution, those guys are in their 50s, 60s. They will pass away soon. If not now, in a decade, in 2 decades. And you have 70% of the population who've never experienced the revolution, and they have very dim memories of the Iran-Iraq war, both of which were very foundational to the Islamic Republic. What happens when the core revolutionary generation dies? There should, you know, a regime would want to pass on its ideals and values to the next generation. However, they're having a very difficult time attracting enough young people into their ideology. I'm not saying there isn't some. Obviously, you have people who go into the Basij. You have the martyr families. But this, and this might be a sufficiently enough minority to hold on. But it still is a big challenge. You have millions of people who don't subscribe to the things that you hold so dear to you.
But these challenges, don't you think that it needs kind of strong opposition to lead it? And what's the chances for the Iranians, while you say that this regime is getting old, to change the regime in Iran?
I think the Iranian youth calculated in response to what happened in 2009, the Green Movement, and the regime was very surgical in its attack on the people. It removed key leaders, and it was able to dissipate the protests and essentially force the opposition underground. Having experienced that, I think that the Iranian youth calculated that it wasn't worth the blood at that moment. That the benefits of, you know, the probability of getting their voices heard and forcing a change in the government was low compared to the costs of the lives that was probably necessary, and they weren't willing to do that. I haven't seen any indication of that calculation changing at the moment. The IRGC remains powerful. The core, the deep state remains very much committed to making sure that there is no hope of, you know, this opposition taking hold and forcing their voice on the government. That may change down the line. That all depends on how the government manages to address this very challenge. Will they be able to provide enough concessions that tapers these grievances and allows the people to somewhat, at least one portion of the population to be co-opted or not? Will it completely keep people out? The benefits of the nuclear agreement doesn't reach people. And in a decade or two, they just haven't been able to at all address this in an effective manner.
Since 2003, there's a new term for Iraq. They say New Iraq. But so far, there's a lack of understanding between the component of the Iraqi people for the new Iraq and living together in Iraq. And this is applied to the political groups. The new generation in Iran, do they have a common understanding for a new Iran?
That's probably one of the biggest challenges that the opposition faces. As much as there seems to be a lot of grievances with the Islamic Republic among the majority of the youth population, there isn't a common theme that binds them together as what would we want our government to look like. You have quite a heterogeneous youth population. You have people that chant that Islam is neither the problem nor the solution, trying to separate state from mosque, if you will. And so you have that, right? But the vision for Iran, whether you want an Iran that has the Islamic component be reflected, or you want an Iran that just ignores the Islamic past and goes back to the ancient Persian Empire, or whether you want an Iran that is in the image of sort of the new thinking the sort of thinking of liberal ideals that you have in the West. These are all different questions that Iran is facing, and the opposition is facing, and they don't have answers to it yet. They haven't been able to answer those. You have a hybrid society, and unless they come up with some sort of a common theme and they can mobilize around it, then there would be some hope for them. At the moment, they don't have that yet, and there are challenges to that. You have a hybrid youth population, and Iran is a complicated country with a complicated past, and so depending on which part of the history you want to pick and choose and define your identity in those terms, that defines the society that you're seeing in Iran.
Some of the opposition groups, their age is more than the age of the Islamic Republic. Mm-hmm. Some of them, after the Islamic Republic, they started. Why they don't have a common goal, and they are more separated from each other rather than to be unified?
I think it's a twofold answer. On the one hand, these opposition groups probably they have very different visions of what a post-Islamic Republic might look like. They might have different grievances with the Islamic Republic. But then on the other hand, it probably has something to do with the Islamic Republic treatment of these groups, trying to separate them. It's the old divide and rule. Everybody does it when it comes to large sort of empire-like states, and Iran has that. But I think at the end of the day, the question is, what do you want Iran to look like? What kind of state do you want Iran to be? And there is no consensus on that.
Another question about the opposition groups. Are they representing the Iranian people? Can we consider them as representatives of the Iranian people, or representing the future of Iran?
Well, it depends on which opposition groups you're speaking about. I think opposition groups in exile have a harder time connecting to the population to some extent. Iran has changed, has gone through a transformation when it comes to just the public, the youth population. 10 years ago, kids looked very much different from today. Iran it's been an accelerated change, if you will. And if you can't connect to them, and your voice is still speaking about a pre-revolutionary ideal that you're trying to communicate to the youth, then probably you don't have as much traction. because the experience of living under the Islamic Republic demands a different kind of, different kind of narrative to be found, something that people are receptive to. If you're talking about opposition groups within Iran, they're not organized. The most you get, at least visibly and publicly, are people whose narrative is shaped within the parameters of Islamic Republic. They're trying to reform the Islamic Republic from within, and that's where the reformists come from. And whether or not they're successful is a different question. The reformists themselves aren't as united. And you have the ones that support the government of Rouhani. They think that getting a little bit is better than just not getting nothing at all. But you probably have a reformist base that finds the entirety of these establishment increasingly difficult to deal with.
Is any chance for Iran to be a federal Iran in the future?
Let me put it this way. Iran is a strong central government. They have strong state capabilities, and they certainly don't have the political will to implement any federalism. And they have the capability to probably prevent that outcome. And we haven't seen any indications of a strong enough opposition to Iran to even challenge IRGC primacy in these regions, let alone lobby for those kind of political objectives.
So what about the political right for the minorities?
Political right for minorities? In what sense?
In Iran, in general. For example, Kurds, if they cannot ruling themselves within a federal Iran, or Baluchis, or Arabs, or Azeris.
I mean, that's certainly a question that Iran has to answer. It has a large population of individuals who have grievances with the government, and Iran, to be an effective state, probably has to take that into account. If not now, then down the line. But at the moment, the state has consolidated control. They have demonstrated willingness to crack down on any sort of opposition to their rule, and they have the capability to do that at the moment.
Nazanin, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.